Director, Clint Muhlfeld. Clint's going to be talking about some of the work he's been doing on salmonids.
Thanks so much. Fish are wildlife too, that's for sure. I had to change the title of my talk tonight. I originally had predicting climate change effects, but first we need to understand the relative influence of climatic variation and how that's impacting aquatic ecosystems and species in order to accurately predict into the future. And so that's a constant theme you're going to hopefully hear throughout my talk. And climate change is predicted to dramatically impact cold water dependent species, yet our empirical understanding of the evolutionary and ecological consequences or impacts of climate change and how that interacts with other human stressors is generally lacking. In response, researchers like myself are trying to conduct species vulnerability assessments to learn more about how species are going to fare under a warming climate, and then feed that information to managers to make informed decisions about when, where, and how to implement proactive conservation and recovery programs to build resiliency and adaptive capacity in a changing climate. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. I'm going to mostly focus on salmonids because they're excellent indicators of ecosystem health and ecosystem change in the face of climate change. They're ectothermic, they're cold water dependent. They occupy some of the coldest waters in the Pacific Northwest, and they're constrained to these linear stream networks where there's nowhere else to go. And not only do they occupy cold water, but they need clean habitat, complex habitat, and connections to complete their life cycle. They travel hundreds of kilometers right back to their stream they were born in to rear and spawn, and they use the entire extent of these watersheds to complete their life history. Not only do they have enormous ecological value, but they also have enormous socioeconomic and cultural values. So they're effectively an excellent target for conservation of aquatic ecosystems and how those processes transcend to terrestrial ecosystems as well. So what do we really know about climate effects and how those interact with other stressors impacting trout and other aquatic invertebrate populations? Are trout and other cold water dependent biota in hot water? Can we do something about it? I'd like to say yes, we can, because clearly trout and other cold water dependent biota have been surviving in an ever-changing climate regime for thousands of years, like in the headwaters of the Columbia Basin with at the end of the last little glacial period about 14,000 years ago. These trout and other aquatic organisms have survived cataclysmic occurrences in the environment, such as flooding, wildfire, extreme temperature events, and glaciation. They've adapted to persist in this changing climate. And this genetic and phenotypic diversity has allowed them to move around and to be able to adapt and persist in a landscape undergoing tremendous change. During cold periods, there were likely sources in the valley bottom and in lakes, rivers, and streams. During warmer periods, they likely retreated to headwater areas for refugia in lakes and headwater areas. So they're truly adapted to persist in a changing climate. But humans on the landscape have caused extensive declines in many populations, and several of which are depressed now. This is through habitat modifications resulting in extensive degradation and fragmentation of critical habitats. We've also introduced exotic species that compete, predate, and hybridize with native species, and resulting in extreme biodiversity loss across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. And climate change is likely going to exacerbate these existing stressors. Already we know in the West, these warming air temperatures are reducing our snowpack, they're increasing our disturbance events like wildfire, and they're dramatically shifting the hydrologic regime. And these changes are resulting in glacier loss, like in Glacier National Park that is predicted to lose all its glaciers by 2030. We're seeing an increase in midwinter floods in a lot of areas across the Northwest, especially the headwaters. We're seeing fires increase like this last year. The shifting hydrologic regime is leading to low summer flows and increased temperatures. And in some cases, this has promoted expansion of non-native species throughout these river systems with irreversible consequences for native species. So what we're trying to do is understand the vulnerability of these species, these cold water dependent sensitive species, to climatic variation. So we started with species distribution models, SDMs. And these have been applied to a wide variety of taxa. They're usually based on occurrence data, looking at where fish are or other organisms are in relation to temperature, identifying a temperature threshold, and then predicting out in the future how that temperature threshold's going to contract or expand, and what the species and their habitats are going to respond. Clearly, it's a pretty basic approach. It's a climate envelope approach, but all these congruently suggest dramatic future reductions in suitable habitat. And so we've done this for bull trout, which is listed as a threatened species under the ESA because of a lot of factors, including climate change. And this salmonid in the Northwest occupies the coldest waters of any Pacific Northwest salmonid. So we've applied our high-resolution spatially explicit temperature and stream flow predictions to this species to understand what kind of climate niche it occupies in both spawning and rearing and foraging, migrating, and overwintering habitats. We've mapped these out across species, across these diverse landscapes, and then applied these spatially explicit models to then show as temperatures warm, so do stream temperatures warm, and that's going to effectively reduce their habitat into the future. And with bull trout and a lot of other systems that they occupy, these large river main stems are warming at a greater rate, and they're likely going to be unsuitable at certain periods of the year under future climate change. And in contrast, though, these headwater areas, these tributaries where they go right back to spawn and rear in, are actually cold water spots on the landscape. So we did a lot of fine scale assessments where we looked at the temperature and flow regimes of these upwelling zones that bull trout spawn in, and lo and behold, these alluvial reaches, these open valley bottoms with a geologic nick point at the bottom, are these huge upwelling zones where there's extensive amounts of groundwater input and hyperureic exchange that causes the temperatures to be colder during the summer, a little warmer in the winter, and they're well oxygenated areas for bull trout to spawn in. So these multi-spatial scale assessments allow us to understand how temperatures might fare into the future, so then we can now prioritize conservation and recovery measures to protect some of these critical habitats from impending climate change. For some species, there's really nowhere to go. We're studying some of these endemic stoneflies that are petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species List Act because of climate-induced glacier and snow loss. They're truly the polar bears of Glacier National Park. They're endemic to these areas. They're found nowhere else on Earth except immediately below these melting ice masses and permanent snow masses in the high country. It's squeeze play at the top of the continent. And so we've tried to better understand the fate of Lednia habitats, for example, under a changing climate. With snow and ice loss, this is the glaciers are predicted to be gone by 2030. So we've applied SDM models to predict how their habitat's going to fare into the future, and lo and behold, we see a dramatic reduction predicted in suitable Lednia habitat into the future. So these kind of rare bugs at the top of the continent, occupying narrow bands of habitat right below these melting glaciers and snow masses, are likely going to be some of the first known species to go extinct under climate warming, potentially. But we need to think beyond these logistic models, these occurrence models, and these temperature models to this climate envelope approach to understand other important evolutionary characteristics that are important for trout, such as genetic diversity, which is the basis for adaptive capacity in a changing climate. So we've applied some genetic data across the Pacific Northwest to understand how genetic diversity is related to climatic variation and habitat variation and threatened bull trout. And lo and behold, genetic diversity in bull trout was negatively correlated with stream temperature warming, increased winter flooding, and positively related to those groundwater influence, those valley bottom areas, in terms of measured allelic richness across the landscape. So bull trout genetic diversity, we found, was strongly related to climate variability. And the areas that are going to warm the most, that are likely going to see increased flooding regimes during the winter that tend to scour the redds where they lay their embryos, those are the areas where genetic diversity or their adaptive capacity is lowest. So the areas that they need it most, there's very little to work with. So managers now are going out there and trying to protect and enhance critical habitats, trying to restore connectivity. In some cases, may even have to do genetic rescue to increase genetic variability to allow them to persist. We're also looking at abundance models. A lot of managers collect abundance information across space and through time. And what we found through our simulation models by combining demographic and genetic factors is that actually abundance time series are early warning signals of environmental change and trout response in a warming climate. So rather than letting trout populations go extinct, we can proactively figure out when they're declining and then implement effective conservation programs to save some of these remaining populations. So a lot of our research, though, now is focused on using the past as a prelude to the future. Can we disentangle the effects of climate change and other stressors on salmonids and other species using real data, empirical data, to then see if our SDM models are correct, see if our laboratory studies are correct, and actually look at the relative influence of these factors to then use that information to build more accurate predictive models to go into the future. Clearly, we always substitute time for space. So we need to build in this third dimension in our assessments. We just did a global review of the literature to look at time series data that were used to look at stream flow and temperature and how that affects trout in a climate sense. And we found, surprisingly, there's only 42 studies out there in the peer-reviewed literature through 2014 that actually use real time series data to look at temperature and flow effects on native trout populations throughout the world. So we've recently begun to work on this using real data and coupling this with our high-resolution climate models and monitoring efforts. We found for the first time that invasive hybridization with rainbow trout, which is the greatest factor leading to the decline of native cutthroat trout throughout the Rocky Mountains, was strongly related to periods of climatic variation. Hybridization is bad for native trout because it disrupts these locally adaptive genes and gene complexes that are linked to these locally adapted traits. And so when that happens, their ability to adapt and persist in a changing environment is greatly diminished. Well, you might ask, well, how does this proceed if there's strong selection against hybridization? And that's because the stocking events over hundreds of years have overwhelmed the selective pressures against hybridization, and they've increased dispersal. They keep radiating out from these sources, and it's like a ratchet. Hybrids produce hybrids, and before long, sometimes all you're left with are hybrid swarms. So our study, we showed that hybridization was only limited to this one source in the lower valley bottom on that left-hand panel prior to the 1970s, despite 20 million rainbow trout being stocked in the system. And it was like a time bomb waiting to go off under the right environmental conditions. We saw a period of dramatic extreme temperature warming and reduction in spring runoff, like I'm showing here with spring precipitation, and hybridization dramatically spread throughout this system, irreversibly corrupting the native genomes that have evolved and adapted to a changing climate for millennia. So climate change is likely going to have indirect effects as well that we need to better understand. And we're expanding on this in the Northern Rockies using thousands of population genetic samples. We're finding the same trends, but everything is context specific. So we're trying to get this information out to managers now for the future. We're also looking at time series data, looking at these endemic stoneflies like Zapata Glacier. It was only found in the Many Glacier area back in the 1960s. We then resample these areas recently. Over the last 4 decades, we've seen a 35% glacial loss in this system, and warm temperatures have been increasing as well. We documented a dramatic upstream range contraction of this imperiled stonefly to only one location now. So it's at the top of the continent, there's nowhere to go. This species might be one of the first known to go extinct. We're also looking at this in terms of bull trout demography. Managers are collecting red count data or identifying their spawning nests, like shown there, to identify population trends through time. And so our idea here is, can we disentangle the effects of climate and other stressors using real data from the past? And lo and behold, what we're finding is the areas that have these these lake-dwelling populations that are free of non-natives are the most productive, they're the most robust populations. And more importantly, perhaps, is that the areas where managers are suppressing non-natives, they're holding on. And they're just as almost nearly as robust as these unimpacted systems. When we look under the hood at the factors driving these dynamics through time and space, patch size matters. We've known that for a long time. But what's really interesting is that temperature or climatic effects are relatively subtle compared to these existing stressors of invasives and habitat and the interaction of roads and exotics in this particular situation. So really it's back to the basics. These existing stressors are what are driving these populations to near extirpation in some cases, and these are the low-hanging fruit kind of conservation measures that we can employ in a changing environment to boost resiliency and adaptive capacity. So as Wayne Gretzky said, let's skate to where the puck's going to be, not to where it's been. We're trying to figure that out, but we're going to miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Clearly, a lot of these decisions are very complex, and a lot of times we have limited data. But my point is that we can use empirical data to disentangle these effects, to more accurately forecast potential impacts, to improve conditions for growth, survival, and persistence of native salmonids. Like throughout the Columbia Basin, we're doing with establishing fish-friendly flows and temperatures. In areas that we can suppress non-natives, get after it. We actually showed here that we can effectively reduce non-natives even when climate change is acting upon these populations. Trade-offs of viewing barriers. This is a major topic in fish conservation now, but we can use this information to help managers make these informed decisions so at least we have something left for future generations that are free of non-natives. And sometimes we got to think out of the box, like conservation introductions. In areas that we have imperiled populations, maybe we should go rescue those populations, bring them to new areas of refugia, so at least we have something left when we can deal with the existing stressors and put them back in their former habitat. And obviously protecting and restoring critical habitats. This is something we've been working on, and in my opinion is the most effective way to bolster resiliency in a changing climate. So we know that fish swim against the flow, and so must we in a changing climate. We're going to have to go against the flow to conserve native trout for future generations. And these trout and char of the Pacific Northwest swim in many rivers and streams and lakes. And if given the chance, they're going to swim on into the future. So thanks so much. Appreciate your attention. Any questions?
Okay, I don't know if you're going to want to address this one, but working with non-native fisheries, say, removing or placing barriers or, taking populations of native fish and putting them in, refugia to keep that stronghold population going. Do you have any suggestions for different land management policies when dealing with non-natives? For example, I work with the Coeur d'Alene tribe. Fish and Game has they have a major fishery in Coeur d'Alene Lake south of Windward that's very supported by the anglers that the tribe just doesn't like as a non-native. When working together in a system like this, where we have two different policies on how to manage a fishery, have you had experience working with them?
Well, I've worked for the state agency, now work for the federal government and university, and obviously, it's a balancing act between providing recreational opportunities and restoring native fish. And so that's always a difficult situation depending on what land or a resource management agency you're talking about. But really context matters. And I don't think we're going to get rid of invasive species in all situations. Really, in just a few we are. So we gotta figure out what has potential and maybe draw the line in the sand there. And it's a grand experiment, trying to figure out, can we do something about it? And as we learn in an adaptive way, then we can inform where we might be able to win those battles and where we can't. But it depends what you have left in a lot of cases. In some situations, if you only have a few populations left, it might be worth it to implement those kind of strategies. So context matters for sure. So
We're going to have to move on to the next one.
I can take
Take them later.
later. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.